to a Hope 1032 podcast.
As followers of Jesus, in whom all things were made, we acknowledge the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the country of where this podcast is recorded. We acknowledge their continuing connection to the land and waters, and thank them for protecting this land and its ecosystems since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and we extend that respect to all First Nations peoples listening today.
Hope Book Club with Georgia and Simone. Because life's just better with a book.
Hi, I'm Georgia and welcome to a bonus episode 68 of the Hope Book Club podcast, where we chat about books from a hope-filled Christian lens. We hope this podcast makes you think, makes you laugh, and most of all, makes you read. We are back from our summer hiatus quite briefly to bring you a very exciting bonus episode, with Sally Colin-James, the author of one of our favourite reads of the year, definitely in my top 3 reads, called One Illumined Thread. A powerful story of 3 women separated by centuries, yet connected by strength, creativity, and the power of the female spirit. In Judea, under the brutal rule of King Herod, a woman yearns for a child but is outcast when she does not fall pregnant. In Renaissance Florence, a young wife is left penniless by her hopelessly unfaithful husband and struggles to find a way to support herself and her young son. And in contemporary Australia, a talented textile conservator, devastated by loss, is desperate to regain control of her life. Each woman wants something that seems unattainable, and it will take all of their courage and determination to achieve it. If you haven't already read this book or listened to our review of One Illumined Thread, you can go back. Our full review is a few episodes ago, episode 61. But let's dive into the chat. Sally Colin-James, it is a pleasure to have you on Hope Book Club today. Thank you so much for being here.
Georgia, it's just so lovely to meet you. Thank you for having me.
Sally, you have had a very successful corporate career before you became an author. Was writing something that you always wanted to do, or something that you came into kind of later in life?
I always wanted to write. Always. I think my first book that I wrote was Sally's Book of Languages, and it had 4 pages, and the first page was French. The first page was English, then French, then German, then Latin. And I managed to fill in 3 of the 4 pages with some version of the languages. But the urge to want to express myself by writing is been there for as long as I can remember.
How did you find the switch from corporate to writing, and how did you actually make that? Was there a tipping point, or was it something that kind of built gradually over your life?
Oh, I love that question. And I was never cut out for the corporate world. Let me say that up front. It just seems so funny to think about myself sitting around those executive board tables and thinking it was my job to share my point of view, and learning very quickly that there were modes of conduct and rules that just didn't, conventions of interaction that was so unnatural to me. And one day, after a particularly difficult week, I was working ridiculous hours and a lot of responsibility, and at the time the only female on an all-male board of executives. And I was driving home in tears and going past a university where I knew you could do creative writing higher degrees, and literally talk about changing the lanes of your life, hopped into the lane that didn't take me home, turned right into the university. It was late, but there were lights on in the humanities area, and went into and found a lady who happened to be one of the professors of creative writing, and cried a lot and said, I just need to do something to provide a structure for me to write. And then that led to a scholarship. And long story short, here I am with my first book. So changing the course of my life in that moment where literally I felt like I was heading in the wrong direction. And the fact that I'd had that awful week was one of the best things that could have happened because it propelled me to start setting up a life of writing.
Oh, that's so great. I love that so much. Let's talk about this novel, your debut novel, One Illumined Thread, and what a debut it was. What sparked the idea behind this? Because it is so unique. It's nothing like I've ever read before.
Oh, that really means a lot to me. Thank you so much. I was in Europe researching my doctorate, and I was critically unwell at the time. I didn't realise how dangerously unwell I was, and I was struggling to follow a map and took a wrong turn at the Uffizi Gallery and ended up before what felt to me before two women. And it was a life-size painting about 2 metres by 1.5 metres. Later, of course, I realised that it was the Virgin Mary and St. Elizabeth. But at the moment of that meeting for me, it was me and the two women I've come to know in their Aramaic names, Elisheva and Mariam. For all the busyness of that gallery that day and all the muddiness of my mind, it was just me, Elisheva and Mariam. And I was struck to stillness and silence by the manner in which the elder Elisheva was looking at Mariam. Something in that deference of eldership, that sense that her whole presence was there. It just gives me skin tingles as I speak about it still. Her whole presence was there to anchor in that eldership towards her younger cousin. And in that moment, I couldn't even articulate what it was. The words weren't there, just this overwhelming sense of, my goodness, this, what I'm here now feeling and being part of, this sense of eldership, of protection, of women being there for women. This is what I'm yearning for. It really struck me in my chest. And I just knew by the end of that day that it was something I would write about. But of course, fast forward 15 years later, I still didn't feel I was ready. But as I sat down to write a different book, it was time to write this one and find a way to articulate across time and space through that portal of a painting, because there was I, as a modern-day Australian woman, looking at a Renaissance painting from the early 1500s, the two women standing under an archway, so almost like a portal through time and space, of two women from ancient Judea. And it just seemed like something in the meeting, in the nexus of that moment across time, deserved expression. And hence the result is One Illumined Thread.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And one of the things both Simone and I loved about the book, and we talk about in the episode, is how well researched it was. Absolutely brilliant, and kind of similar, what I think, in terms of research to Pip Williams' Dictionary of Lost Words, Bookbinder of Jericho, just those historical elements really woven throughout. But what was your process in researching Elisheva and Mariam, and also Antonia in Renaissance Florence? Those kinds of, obviously, you took some liberties, but there are historical elements kind of throughout. How did you decide which ones to keep in the book and which to kind of sacrifice for the sake of the story?
Well, the first very clear answer to that is, for me, I developed a rule of thumb in this very complex research and the writing in a polynarrative style. All the layers, all the connections requires a lot of thinking across time and space. Ignorance is bliss. I'm glad I didn't know what I was getting myself in for, and I was just led by the call of my heart. But the rule of thumb I developed was, where the research impeded the sense of the character, then to me, the character and the story were preeminent. That got to be the most important thing. However, when pulling this all together and knitting it together in a subtle and yet complex way, that was very much aided by historical context and sources and historical documents over time. But first and foremost, the women had to be able to step out of their context. It had to be their story, and the research, the factual research, had to serve that and not the other way around. So that was very, very clear to me. In terms of Antonia Ugolini, that is actually, there was a big pivot point on the way the story came to life and to light after that moment before the painting, when I tried for the longest time to find anything, in-depth information about Mariotto Albertinelli, who was the artist that painted La Visitazione, the one that is the backbone to the book. And over a course of, must have been months, I finally stumbled upon this Latin writ that I needed to get translated, which I did from a scholar in Oxford. And it revealed that, and on the death of Albertinelli, he left his young wife with all of his debts, and that she, including to Raffaello, the famous Raphael artist, and she was hauled before a judge. And I thought, oh, good gracious, imagine. It's difficult enough these days, but in those days, and the roles and duties of a wife. And so what was that moment for her? How did she arrive at that point, and what did she do after that? And henceforth her pursuit of finding the perfect white paint in order to gain sovereignty and agency at a time that it was, of course, very difficult for widows, especially women and widows, to do that. In the case of Elisheva, there, of course, as we know, in English, is St. Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, the very fleeting references to her in the Bible. But where my pivot point for that story came from was the fact that it seemed to me, from looking at various translations of the Bible, that her husband Zachariah didn't take a handmaiden in order for them to bear children. And so to me, that could have been a love story, that in those times when it was expected that a man bore an heir, that it was expected that a woman bore many children, and the fact that in late age, if we refer biblically, that still that hadn't occurred, but Zachariah hadn't taken a handmaiden, I thought, oh my goodness, what if that his love for his wife was such that he defied, even as a priest of the time, he defied the conventions and said, no, if I'm going to bear a child, it will be with my wife. And so that was at the heart. And then to twist that further, as we find very early on, that Elisheva always had her eye on Zachariah, even though he was 15 years older than her, and would spy on him in the fields. But the backbone of that love story, and then placed against a very different, more of a friendship with Antonia Mariotto, to flesh out all the different ways that marriage might work across time, and the ways that it still is relatable to us today.
Yeah, so important. And look, there is so much that connects these women. You've just talked about a few of these. You use very specific connective devices that connect these women in the story. A lot of these are art forms. What else connects these women, and why does it matter? We're reading 3 stories across 2,000 years. Why? Why does it matter that they're connected?
I was struck by the very deep question of what has really changed for women since the time of Elisheva. So the most important, and perhaps some readers might find it subtle and nuanced, other readers might find it the thing that stands out the most. The fundamental connection between these women is their humanity. I seem to, and I guess it's what I most appreciated about the critical review that yourself and Simone and David conducted, was that seeing and feeling that humanity of women like Elisheva and Mariam, or St. Elizabeth and the Virgin Mary, who've become iconic. But what's underneath that? What is their humanness? What was their experience as flesh and blood? So that connection is very important to me, that we can draw together similarities across time and space of the way women, the issues and the problems they face. There are other objects that move through time and space that are crafted by the different women and move backwards and forwards, which to me, especially in the case of the black glass that Elisheva invents and becomes quite entrepreneurial about. I mean, that in and of itself is representative. When you talk to glass archaeologists, they say, no, there's no way that that kind of black glass would exist at that time. They were so patient with my desire to create fictive devices. But Elisheva creates that completely herself, the same as Antonia or Antonia creates that white paint, or just this industry, this female entrepreneurism that's so important. So that it sits behind those mechanisms, those artifacts that travel through time and space, on the premise, in my mind, and why it's so important for us to continue with our brave voyages of creativity, whatever that may be, because in one day or 1,000 years, you never know when that creative artifact will arrive in the hands and life of another and change their life for the better. So there are artifacts, but at the heart of that is this sense of industry. And it's also the sense of wanting to shine a light on the work of women as very different in retrospect to what people might think. There's a professor, Carol Myers, who's done this wonderful exposition on the fact that when women sat around to grind grain and make bread, that wasn't an act of banal industry. That was an act of creative connection that had its own language, that had its own hierarchy, that bore its own fruits, that ran much deeper than the bread that was shared at the table. So the sense of the way women touch and create and how that travels through time, for those that want to dig really deep, then there is layer upon layer upon layer in the novel that speaks to that notion.
Yeah, it's so wonderful. Let's talk about the art forms as well, because I just loved reading about the white paint and the glass blowing. It was so well researched. And I understand that you actually traveled like all around the world and tried a whole bunch of these art forms. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Given that my husband is the one that sews the buttons on in our household, the textile conservation was just all of these skills, the textile conservation, the glass blowing and the paint making, were worlds within worlds. And I tell you one thing, the women behind some of this work, from the Met, from Durham University, from Art Lab, we have some of the world's most preeminent textile conservators here in this country, in this nation, one of whom, Kristen Phillips, was invited by the government of India to do the conservation on Indira Gandhi's sari. And these are women that sit behind closed doors looking at microscopic worlds in order to preserve a sense of who we are in the world. So I spent a lot of time in different studios for the textile conservation, and of course talking to chemists around the world and paint makers actually about the art of paint making. Is still very traditional. There's not a lot that's changed about the art of traditional paint making, and people still use it. The grinding, the selection of materials, and also glass blowing has preserved a lot of the way that it is done. It hasn't really changed very much. It's just access to different materials. That art of glass blowing is what was the most confronting and hardest for me. And I did spend a lot of time in Australian studios with some of the world's best glass blowers, including Claire Belfridge in Adelaide. But I also travelled to Palestine and Israel and spent time in the north at Caesarea in a glass blowing studio there, working with glass, and also down in Hebron with one of the longest running family glass blowing businesses, Hebron Glass, which was an experience of a lifetime. Tawfiq Natcher, the Natcher family, and his ability to, with probably as few tools as what Elisheva uses in the book, just with his eye, with technique, to produce these goblets and glassware that's sold around the world is just, it is humbling. It's absolutely humbling. And the fact that when I attempted to do, because the glass blowing up in the north, well, that was difficult and hot and hard and your eyes water. It's every bit as grueling as what you now see on things like the Netflix series. But when I went down south to Hebron with the Natsha family, their piping is smaller. It's a far more ancient way that they do the glass blowing, and requires such a deftness of timing. But they're such beautiful people that when I had my attempt, which just went so wrong, that the first thing that Tawfiq Natsha said to me, he said, no. I was trying to create the beginnings of a goblet. And I said, oh, I've just really ruined it. And he looked at it and he said, no, you've made a cow's bladder. So talk about the willingness to see the diamond in the rough. So, but that whole experience of the hard work, the graft, the grit, the fumes, the backbreaking work of glass blowing is something I will treasure forever. I will treasure forever.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's, really wonderful. Now, look, one thing that Simone in particular noticed about the book, and we talked a little bit in the episode, was how Dr. Elizabeth Reed's story, who is in current times in Adelaide, the textile conservator, it kind of serves as a placeholder story for modern women. We could see ourselves in Dr. Reed's shoes. Was that a deliberate choice on your behalf?
Yes, and a deeply personal choice. I will let Hope FM listeners know. A deeply personal choice. A fundamental question, and it is a question without agenda. It is a sincere inquiry. I began to ask over and over, what has really changed for women and children, actually, in truth, since the time of Elisheva? And I didn't want to enter that question with the angst of personal experience at that stage. I felt like I really wanted to look at it, and to look at it in context, and to look at one world relative to another. And the more that sincere inquiry, I really encourage people to ask the question, see how it makes them feel. A lot of women, even I ran a counselling and coaching practice for a long time in Melbourne when I stepped out of my corporate career, and I noticed the worry of women to even give themselves permission to ask these really deep questions. Hang on. What is really going on here? And am I okay with it? So just taking all that knowledge from the counsellor's side of the table and allowing myself space for inquiry, and realising that I don't feel, in context and relative, that enough has changed, and that Dr. Reed could be the placeholder for that skilled, intelligent, humble, dedicated, loyal, flawed human woman who has decided that looking at the world and the context of her world, it is not enough, it is not okay, that there needs to be a shift. Where is she going to draw that courage from to make that shift? Well, first and foremost, asking that question, how? Okay, this is not okay for me. This is not the life I want to lead. So what next? What next for Dr. Reed? And it was just so beautiful that the both of you recognise that is a placeholder not only for women who feel like that they need to change their life circumstances, but also a model of how difficult that can be, and that often it's not a set of complicated steps. It is merely stopping and deciding, I don't know what the answer is next, but I definitely want to know. I want to know. And the fact that Dr. Reed has that creative, her work as a textile conservator is what anchors her, what grounds her, that sense of movement, of stitching, of touching a relic, that embroidery, that Edwardian embroidery that she's working on, and using that as a touchstone for being able to have a new version of your life, which is basically what she's giving to the embroidery she's working on. So thank you for the chance to sort of respond to that. I feel that very sadly, what is the nature of Dr. Reed's experience and world is still all too common. And without giving too much away, people will understand that if they choose to read the book. And so what next? What are we as women going to do about improving the lives of other women?
Sally, along with art and humanity, faith is a driving factor in this book. And the book is obviously full of biblical references. As we know, Elisheva is based on Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother. Can you share more about what you drew on when writing about faith, your personal experience with faith?
I really love this question. And this is something I haven't had the opportunity to share as I've been travelling around for festivals and publicity and promoting the book. So you guys get to hear it here. Many years ago, when I used to do, and I lived in Melbourne, and I used to do the washing up in the funny little annex kitchen at the back, I'd put on Radio National, The Spirit of Things. It was a wonderful program. There was a session on saints and who were these saints and what had the different institutions and religions done with saints. And the thing that stood out the most for me and has really come all these years later in life as a fundamental thing I return to for my own sense of spirituality is one thing they said about saints. And the person being interviewed said, the point about saints in my mind is that they are models for human behaviour. And he said the trouble is with some of the churches, they've sort of pushed the saints out of the realm of being mentors for humans and into the realm of the unattainable. And he said that's one of the saddest things for me, because saints were human. They were human men and women and lived and breathed and loved on the face of the earth. So that really did reflect to me my own innate sense of my connection to my spirituality. And that is that humans are a vital part of this. That it's not just, the drudgery that it is to be human and then the magnificence of everything else, the saints and God and the angels, that we're all threaded together in this experience and expression of what it means to be a human. And I feel it's interesting that it just always comes out in my writing of wanting to address those we might consider as iconic, but not to bring them down to size, to elevate the position and the potentiality of what it means to be humans. I love humans and I love being a human and I love being a human woman. And I feel that especially now, and you can imagine how I've been feeling with my colleagues and friends in Palestine and Israel, more than ever, and of course in Russia and of course ongoing in other places around the world, that absolute necessity to keep our faith in the better nature of the better angels of our nature, into understanding that does exist for a human, within a human, and how best do we allow that to thrive. So that is that underlying sense of faith or spirituality or whatever you call it. I hope that's answered the question for you on what that is for me and in writing this novel.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Sally, you've mentioned in previous interviews that your own faith was completely rocked by an incident a few years ago in an emergency situation on a plane that you were in. When was this and what happened?
I know. It still seems like the strangest thing, but it really was a gift in the end. It was over some remote islands in the Pacific, and the engine had what is known as a catastrophic failure. It exploded.
That sounds horrifying.
It definitely was an experience. In that moment, because I knew it was going to happen, let me say that, I felt it. Before I got onto that plane, sitting on that plane, I said to my now husband, I'm sitting near that engine. I don't feel okay about it. And there's a photo with me with my arms crossed, very, very clear nonverbal communication, looking at this engine, feeling this rising sense of panic, and also saying, right, closing my eyes and saying, okay, if I'm meant to be on here, please, I need a sign. Or if I'm meant to get off, I don't care who I embarrass. I will get off this. I will get off this plane. And I closed my eyes and really tried to calm myself. My heart just felt like it was beating out of the top of my chest, the middle and top. And when I opened my eyes, the pilots, because it's a very small plane, so you could see the dash of where the pilots were sitting, they switched on all their dashboard buttons, and two of my favourite numbers came up, ones and fours, just in succession on the screen. And I just felt an overwhelming sense of calm. But then, of course, as we took off, that panic started to rise again. And the whole experience, fortunately, everyone walked away from it. We managed to duck and dive and plunge and land. And it was one of those experiences where my life didn't flash before my eyes, but there was a moment when I looked at the man who's now my husband, and the magnitude of both the fleetingness but eternality of a human life was so profound. And I felt if we both come out of this alive and live to 100, it still won't be enough for me to spend time with this human. And what that brought up was a magnificent and unbearable grief, but it was magnificent and it was unbearable, the nature of which could be applied to all people that I loved. This moment in timeless, but not how people say, oh, life's a blink. Not, it was a paradox. It was that blink, but also the eternity and the opportunity of that with other humans with us, that there exists in every breath. There was a sanctity over human life that I feel changed my physiology. I was not the same woman that got off that plane. And in fact, something to share with any listeners going through any sort of trauma or recovery. If somebody had said to me, maybe not day one after the explosion, but maybe a couple of weeks after that, Sally, the best road to healing is to realise that you are no longer that woman that got on the plane, and to really now just reintegrate into the person you are now, it would have made the process a lot less painful, because I think we spend a lot of time wanting things to be how they were before. And of course, physics and science tell that's not possible. You don't even have the same any cell in your body in 12 months from now. You're cellularly completely different. So in terms of a rocking of a faith or a sense of spirit or a sense of what it is to be human, I feel the greatest explosive crumbling the earth under your feetness was that sense of living in that contradiction, the blink and the eternity. And in every breath, therefore, as above, so below, in every breath, there is that opportunity for grace and not to waste, therefore, a single breath.
Goodness me. Thank you for that wisdom. Final question on the book, and then we'll get into some summer read recommendations. Would love to hear what you've been reading and what you'd recommend. In what ways do you feel that women and their roles can be more appreciated and celebrated and honoured by history? I feel like you've done such a service to these three women, but also just so many women throughout history in this book. In what ways can we do that better?
Well, I feel the art of sitting in creative connection the First Nations people know this. Basket weaving, grinding grain, cooking, whatever. They're being in creative connection with other women. And so many women have said to me, oh, I'm not creative. And I said, well, did you compliment someone today? Did you make a packed lunch? Did you fold a nappy or a bit of washing? For me, female creativity is as much about touch and intention and what that means down the line. I do this for you. There's a beautiful humility and selflessness in that. And to find those ancient ways of coming together in creative connection. For instance, avoiding the question in conversation like, oh, what do you do? And instead saying, oh, what's your favourite painting? Or what are you reading? Or what are you cooking? Or what are you gardening? You know, making that our go-to portal of connection. And it sounds basic and also probably sounds a little bit abstract, but I find when I was in the corporate world, even in our very recent generation, Georgia, I just was staggered by the fact that in order to be a success, a woman was expected to act like a man. And what's the point of that? Because there's plenty of men that can act like men. And I don't feel that's changed enough. And I feel like women come up against all sorts of objections when they want to conduct their jobs with sensitivity, with warmth, with a greater sense of egalitarianism, you know. And I'm not saying it's wrong to sort of have processes of hierarchy that can work under certain situations, but there's got to be that balance of the triangle and the circle, you know. So anything that brings women into that circularity of connection, and starting just in your own backyard with your friends, with your daughters, with your aunties, really bringing that sense of the sacred back into everyday life, just like the ancients did when they wove baskets and ground grain.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. And it has been such a pleasure to talk about your book. All right, before you go, a couple of quick fire questions. If you had to recommend one book to our listeners to read this summer, apart from your own, everyone go and read One Illumined Thread. What would you recommend?
If people are interested in this subject, I highly recommend women in connection and women's point of view. Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible is an utter sheer delight. You know, she gave me a lot of strength in the writing of One Illumined Thread because she made the comment that it took her 30 years to feel ready and anchored enough to write that book, The Poisonwood Bible.
All right, we loved this novel so much, and I don't want to rush you, but is there anything else in the works that you could give us a hint about? Yes. Can you give us a little teaser?
Well, there is another similarly veined notion of monks on a journey to outback South Australia because they believe that the next Dalai Lama will reincarnate out there. Oh. So that's a very quirky intersection, again, of spirituality and the heart of outback Australia, set around Kaditanda Lake Eyre in the north of South Australia, this vast, mostly dry salt lake. And there is actually 2 really exciting children's books that I'm putting together that focus on language and keeping the richness and vitality of language alive. And then there's also another adult novel that is a very different kind of love story, but is the intersection of spirituality, philosophy and science. So, yeah, just a bit.
Oh, they all sound delightful. Oh, I'm so excited. Well, Sally Colin-James, it has been a pleasure chatting to you today. One Illumined Thread is out now wherever you get your books, and you can find more from Sally at her website, sallycolinjames.com. Thank you so much for being on Hope Book Club.
Thank you, Georgia. Blessings to you, my darling.
And that just about wraps up our bonus episode. We'd love for you to be a part of our community as well. So if you haven't already, the Hope Book Club Facebook group, you can search for that on your socials, and you can head to our website for more details about the podcast as well, hope1032.com.au. We'd also love this podcast to reach more people. So the way to do that, rate, review, subscribe, share this episode with a friend. Honestly, the way that we've been able to grow the group so far this year has just been people sharing it with someone in their life that they love. We're going to go back into hibernation now for a few weeks, but we'll be back early to mid-February, busily reading and preparing for next year. We'll leave you with a quote from Emma Thompson. I love this one from her. I think books are like people, that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. We'll catch you next time.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.